Hi, I'm Allison Schlesinger. You're all so far away. If you want to come up here, you can. I cannot hear, so I have interpreters with me that are going to be helping me if you have any questions. So if you do have a question, raise your hand and we'll wait for them to turn around and look at you. So before we start, because I always like to find out who's in the audience, and then I will tailor this a little bit to that. So let's go around real quick and tell me what your interest is and what you would like to get out of this today, and then I'll make sure we get to it. So, do you mind?
Yes, my name is Iris Carter. I'm a guardian ad litem, and I'm just looking for more information. I went to interpreting school for the deaf a while back, and I've just always been interested in the culture and the rights.
Great, thank you. Hi.
Michelle Hampton, the 20th Circuit. I'm the Assistant Director. I just felt like I needed more information, and having recently become a little hearing impaired myself, it was interesting.
Okay, cool. Hi.
I'm Leslie Reed-Miller. I work in the State Council Office and Court Education Program Coordinator. So I'm here to learn and also to see where some educational needs may be for our judges so that we can plan educational programs.
Oh, okay, great. Hi.
My name is Heidi Kemp, and I'm an attorney at my office, the Hurricane Circuit in Florida. And I currently have a child that I'm mentoring for who is deaf and hard of hearing, and I'm representing him in court. And there's not many of them, so I thought that this might be a way to gain information about resources and things to be looking for when we do have these children on the case list.
Okay, perfect. This will be perfect for you then. All the way back, that's you, I think, yep.
My name is Nick Sazina. I'm the trial court administrator for the 10th Judicial Circuit in the state of Florida, and I'm here to make sure our court system is providing access to the court system for people with disabilities of all ages.
Okay.
My name is Christian Kedka with the Guardian Ad Litem program. I'm just here to see what services are out there for deaf and hard of hearing children.
Okay.
James Phillips, I'm an attorney with the Guardian Ad Litem program, and I'm just looking for anything that I can apply to our kids that are in care, and that we can do.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Megan Haskins, and I'm here with the President John Jackson from the General Counsel Office for the Department of Children and Families. We're the office CMS provider unique to that hard of hearing children.
Okay.
I actually constantly do a lot of disability advocacy for different areas in my community, and this is one area that I'm not familiar with, so I was hoping to just maybe some more insight and information.
Okay.
Good afternoon, I'm John Jackson with the General Counsel's Office at DCF. I'm also on the Florida Coordinating Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, so I have lots of obvious interest in coming to see Allison.
Thank you.
Catherine Jones, also from the General Counsel Office at DCF, and I'm just here to learn whatever I can. Lisa Eilerson, Office of General Counsel at DCF as well. I'm just here to learn more about the resources that are available to you.
Hi.
I'm Clarissa Diaz. I'm a case coordinator for the Guardian Ad Litem program here in Orange County. I've not had any personal experience with this topic, so I just wanted to hear.
Okay.
I'm Kimberly Van Diver. I'm also an attorney with the Guardian Ad Litem program. I took sign language in high school and was familiar with the deaf community probably about 15 years ago. So I'm just here learning what new things that if they may need or any sort of services.
Okay, cool. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is turn my hearing aids down because this microphone is doing something to them. So you guys all have to work hard today. I can't hear anything now. Okay, so I wanted to put together a PowerPoint for you, but I definitely want you to feel free to ask me questions anytime. And definitely raise your hand so I can see you, because I will not This thing is messing my hearing aids up. I also have my dog with me, Zeta. She's a service dog, so she's down here on the floor. She snores, so if she snores too loud, let me know, I'll wake her up. But she'll probably sleep through the whole thing. I put this title on here because this is the biggest issue, is ensuring equal access to services. And I started out as a CPI, as you know them, in California many years ago. And then I was a case manager. I worked with Children's Court in Los Angeles. I did all those things. And the biggest issue was always getting the right services. So people would court order family counseling or parenting classes or something, and they'd send them off, but they didn't know where they were sending them. So then it became an issue of who's going to pay for interpreters. In Los Angeles, they're fortunate enough to have a lot of direct service programs, so they didn't need interpreters. There were deaf and hard of hearing people, professionals providing the classes, but they didn't take the time to seek those out. So quite often, deaf parents especially, their cases would run on 6 months longer on average than other families because they just were being passed around, and it really was quite unfair. So from the beginning is where it's very important as an advocate to get them on the right track. So this is me. I work for the Office of Civil Rights. I'm in the Tampa office, though. And at any time, even after the presentation, you're welcome to contact me if you have any other questions. And I think the PowerPoint is in the system for the conference. So this is what we're going to talk about. There definitely, for the deaf community, is a separate culture compared to other disabilities. It's a different animal. We're going to talk about exactly what the issues are, what it's like for a deaf child going through our system, and how the big keywords for the ADA is how do you ensure equal access and effective communication. And we'll talk about how DCF fits in there, and then there'll be some last things to talk about. So a lot of people, the deaf community often talks about itself as being a small world, and it kind of is. It's sort of a little fishbowl of communication, and I have to say, I'm kind of old now, but once the internet started coming around, boy, the world is smaller, especially for deaf people. So gossip travels very quickly. Something happens in California, and a couple hours later, everybody in Florida knows, that kind of thing. It really has been wonderful, though, for networking and for deaf people to support each other more. There are a lot more ways of receiving information than in the past. And in a way, that's very good for all of us when it comes to advocacy and education, because deaf people may choose to do something online rather than going to a class where they would need an interpreter. So we have a lot more options. The other piece of this that's really important is the attitude. And I think if nothing else, everything begins with our attitude towards people and what we assume about them. So a lot of deaf people feel very strongly that all they cannot do is hear. That's it. My brain is fully functional. I went to school, I did all the things, I have children. It's not like I can't function in the world. It makes everybody else uncomfortable that I can't hear, but it doesn't bother me at all, right? So there's definitely I am a whole person versus just my ears do not work very well. A lot of people get very hung up on the hearing and forget to look at the whole person or the whole child. There's a lot to a person than just their hearing. So one example I can give you, after my father died, I decided I needed to go to some kind of grief counseling. And so and I had to pay, at the time I was young, so I didn't have good health insurance that would cover it, so I had to pay cash. And this therapist, the first 3 sessions, all she wanted to talk about was my hearing loss. And I was like, okay, I explained the whole story, and she asked about my education and all this stuff, and I was like, you know what, really there's a lot more to me than my hearing loss. Can we move on and talk about something else? And that happens a lot to people, that it becomes this big focus rather than who I am, So that's the kind of thing I think is important for all of us to remember, regardless of who we meet, is they're a complete person, and whatever one little thing about them stands out, that's okay, but they're still a complete person, and there's a lot to them. So it's very important not to have any biases. And I know I've had a lot of, over the years, many questions about deaf people, and they will tell you exactly that all disabled people, from everyone I've spoken to, they would much prefer you just ask them, what do you need? What's important to you? How can I help you fully participate in this, instead of assuming that you know or to try to guess. And sometimes I think people feel very nervous about asking questions, but I would much prefer you ask me than to just go ahead and do whatever you think it is that I need you to do, right? Do you have any questions so far? Okay. So I will give you a little bit of Deaf 101 here. Some of you may already know this, but I'll go through it. And again, there's absolutely nothing you can ask me that would offend me or insult me. I'd rather you ask me and we talk about it here, and we'll all promise to not embarrass anybody. The terms you want to use are deaf, hard of hearing, late deafened, and deaf-blind. The term hearing impaired is no good. We don't say that anymore. It implies that you're broken, there's something wrong with you, that kind of thing. So it's really important to get away from the word impaired. The definitions are mostly, people that are deaf tend to be, everybody self-identifies differently. And my kids will tell you, some days I'm deaf and some days I'm hard of hearing. It kind of depends. If I'm really tired or I'm sick or something, my hearing goes out the window. Most hard of hearing people will wear hearing aids usually, or they can talk pretty well, maybe not. It's a very broad spectrum of things. So when I don't have my hearing aids, then I can't hear anything. So it's very subjective. Hearing aids happen to help me. They don't help everybody. Some people hate them. For some people, their type of hearing loss just doesn't work with hearing aids. So everybody really is very individual. Late deafened usually means people that lost their hearing later in life, usually to age or maybe some sort of accident or illness or something like that. But most of their life they could hear, and then later on they lost or were losing their hearing. Deaf-blind, again, is a huge range. So usually people that identify as deaf-blind are people that can't have a conversation. They can't hear well enough just to talk and listen without hearing aids or anything. And they can't see well enough to drive, maybe, is the range. But it's up to the individual how they choose to identify. But that doesn't mean totally deaf, totally blind. There's a whole big range of people in there. Do you have any questions about those? So you have to promise never to say hearing impaired again. That's got to go. And we don't use the term mute either. That's, when someone can't speak, a lot of times people will say they're mute, but that's not a term that's used anymore. And it doesn't have anything to do with providing services or an education, anything like that. I put this together really quick because there's a lot of confusion. There's so much new technology, and it's really very cool. For you all, if you have a child or their family members that are deaf and you're needing to communicate with them, it's important to know the difference between a couple of these things. Video relay service is when you make a phone call and you call through a phone or computer and you're seeing the interpreter live on the screen. That's only for making phone calls. It is not, you can't make a video relay service call when you're in the same room as your client. The FCC is very strict about these things and people can get in a lot of trouble. Well, it's only for phone calls. Video remote interpreting is a new thing where you can contract with an interpreting service, you connect with them online, and you can call up, or I don't know if you schedule ahead, or you can usually schedule ahead. I don't really use it. So if you're going to have an appointment with if you have a VRI contract, and a lot of the state access ESS offices, most of them all now have a VRI. So you just log on to a regular computer that has a webcam, and the customer can sit there with you and have a conversation, and they can see the interpreter on the screen. That kind of thing works really well for an ESS or access appointment, but it's very difficult for other things like therapy or ongoing treatment. It's because you're getting a new interpreter every time. That interpreter may have no experience in mental health interpreting. It can be very difficult, but it's really good for just general business. It's also very important if you're hiring interpreters to only hire RID certified interpreters. That's the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. That's a national certification that interpreters need to get to be an interpreter in any kind of professional setting. There are educational certifications that are used in school, but for any type of service you're providing, legal, counseling, anything like that, medical, you need to have a certified interpreter. You can go to their website, it's rid.org, and you can look up to make sure the interpreter is certified. DCF has a policy that for any services they or any of their managing entities, subcontractors provide, they need to provide a certified interpreter. Do you have any questions about interpreters before we go on? Okay, that's usually a sticky one, so if you think of anything, let me know. CDIs, I've noticed, are not used a lot in Florida, but it's becoming more popular, particularly in court. Because what happens in court is things are moving so quickly. There's a range of people out there, just like hearing people. Deaf people have a range of education levels and understanding of English. And even I have gone as an advocate sometimes to court and been like, you know, in 10 minutes, the judge is saying this, the lawyers are saying that, I'm trying to watch the interpreter, it's very hard to catch it all. And you can't look down and take notes because then you're not seeing the interpreter. So certified deaf interpreters are a deaf person who's fluent in American Sign Language, and they are watching the other interpreter. They translate it further into whatever level of ASL the customer needs. So it can be taking that high level of legal jargon and bringing it down to more of a pure ASL, because the ASL is not English, not even close. So they move it further, and they usually try to talk with a client beforehand so they can get a feel. Some people, their first language was Spanish, and now they're learning American Sign Language. So it can be a combination of lots of things. But CDIs are very effective in court. Pocket talkers are used, usually I know that a lot of our ESS and Access offices have them, but it's just a little, kind of like a mic where it's mostly for people that are late deafened and just need some amplification. So it has a range of like 15 feet, and it picks up whatever's happening, and you have little headphones and they can hear a little bit better with that. But it's definitely not hearing aids. The pocket talker is just amplification, just volume. Hearing aids, it's very important to understand that it does not correct your hearing like glasses correct your vision. It does not. The parts of your hearing that's gone, it's gone. Hearing aids help. They're not perfect, but the technology is also varied. So a lot of people like to try to use our medical insurance to get hearing aids, and you're usually at the mercy of the companies they choose and the types of hearing aids they'll let you buy. If you have the money and you can pay cash for your hearing aids, you can get high-end, very nice hearing aids. So, for example, I just got some that were kind of in the middle, but there are a lot of things I don't want to hear. And it's funny that audiologists will say, well, don't you want to hear the birds? And don't you want to? I'm like, I want to hear people talking. That's number one. So we sit there. They hook me up to a computer, and then we play with it until we get it the way I want it. I don't like to hear my car. So I try to get somebody else to get in my car every now and then to make sure it sounds right. I don't know what it's supposed to sound like. But I don't want to hear the engine stuff. And to me, I need my energy to focus on things I want to hear. And hearing aids can bring in way too much, and it makes you very tired. And that happens a lot with kids. They often will have kids have their hearing aids turned up quite a bit. They get very tired by the end of the day. Then they have behavior problems, and it just becomes a big cycle. So whenever if kids say to you, I don't like my hearing aids or things like that, that can sometimes just be that it's just draining, and you can have them adjusted lots of different ways. So cochlear implants are another thing that has come along. About 25 years ago they started. And it is a technology that, again, does not replace, it does not fix hearing. It helps some people, not everybody. It's a surgical procedure, and they implant stuff in your head that connects with a device on the outside. I don't know if you're familiar with them. But that's a whole subject unto itself, but I wanted you to know the difference between the two. So do you have any questions about these? Okay. So the reason the deaf community is very different is the language. And just like any culture out there in the world, their language is where a lot of their traditions and storytelling and all those kinds of things, the jokes we tell are very different. American Sign Language is, like I said, very different from English. We have fun jokes. But it really is a whole community unto itself. And a lot of deaf people do have a hard time sometimes being lumped in with all the other disabilities because it is a very different thing. That language access really creates a different need. It is definitely the fastest growing disability group for the obvious reasons. So it's extremely difficult. I don't know if this is hard to see. It's very difficult to get statistics. Our census doesn't ask anymore about disability. Maybe the next time around they will. But it's been a long time since they have. There's different ways out there of compiling this information. But in general, it's usually somewhere between 9 to 22 people out of every 1,000 have some sort of hearing loss. But it's probably more than that, if you think about it. So how people identify as being a member of the deaf community is usually they know sign language and their social life may revolve mostly around the deaf community. Maybe not entirely. But I have noticed when we're providing services, as people lose their hearing with age, that is also a big gap for people. So we do get questions sometimes. Not everything is easily accessed online. Sometimes, people that have lost their hearing later, you can't just pick up the phone and make a phone call. And if you don't know sign language, you don't have access to video relay. So they get stuck in the middle of that. Oh, I wanted to show you this because a lot of people are surprised by the structure of the deaf community and how different it is. We have a national organization called the National Association of the Deaf. And it kind of looks like our government. So every state has delegates and chapters, and then every 2 years they send them to a national conference where they vote on different things. And then they take those priorities that they choose back to the national office in Maryland and they move forward with those. So right now one of them is child welfare. And that's a big topic across the country for the deaf community and boosting up some of those child welfare laws. They're the ones that will sue the airlines. I don't know if you remember when, I think American Airlines was the first one to provide captioning on their flights. Netflix, NAD did the Netflix lawsuit, and I think they did the one for Hulu and all of that too to make sure all those people were captioning their services. They take on all kinds of different types of lawsuits on behalf of the deaf community. It's a big organization. So we have our Florida Association for the Deaf chapter here. It's actually one of the stronger ones in the country. And they have smaller chapters all over Florida. They do a lot of education and advocacy and different projects around the state. The Florida Coordinating Council for Deaf and Hard of Hearing is the one that John is a member of, and they also work to provide education and advocacy resources. They network with each other and talk about what are the current issues in the state, and then they report all that back to the governor. We have the Florida School for the Deaf in St. Augustine, and that is every state, almost every state, some of them have lost their schools, they have a residential school. You can either be a resident or a day student, but it's a school for deaf kids. I don't know, there's pros and cons to it. Lots of people have different ideas about residential education. The School for the Deaf in Florida is actually a really good one. It's a very big program. They have lots of support services there. We have an association for deaf blind in Florida. That's also, they're a great networking group for them and also for their resources that they need. RID I mentioned, they're the ones that certify interpreters. We have a Florida chapter. Every state has a chapter, and they do their own networking and advocacy for each other. What else do they do? They maintain the list of certified interpreters, and they provide a lot of training workshops and things. And like I was saying, I'm hoping they'll do more mental health interpreting training here in Florida. They're actually coming up with specialized training certificates. One of them is legal interpreting, mental health, and like I said, they have the specialized education, and there's a few of them now. So beyond that, for college, Gallaudet University, that's where I went for my bachelor's. That's in Washington, D.C., and it's the only liberal arts university in the world that is specifically for deaf students. And it was really, it saved my life. It really was a great place to go and have access to every possible thing I could want. It really, having that access, I think, it's the one thing I leave you with today, is that when any disabled person, but deaf especially, when they're given complete access and feel like they're on an equal playing field, it makes all the difference. It really does. But beyond that, we have a World Federation for the Deaf that is focused mostly on education. And it's really fascinating to see all the different countries in the world and how they choose to educate their deaf children. But they meet once every 2 years, or more, maybe it's more. But it goes all over the world, and people from every country come and talk about how they're educating, and they share their information with each other. And then we have our own Olympics. Deaf people are not part of the regular Olympics usually. I mean, if you think of things like swimming, if they're shooting the little gun to dive into the pool, a deaf person's not going to hear that. They can't have their head up to look to see someone tell them to go. There's always going to be a delay. So that kind of thing is how this ended up coming about. But it's a big deal. The Deaf Olympics is a big deal. And it moves all around the world every couple of years. So to get back to all of this, it is important to note that our deaf kids, and it can be hearing kids with deaf parents, either way, they touch every aspect of our system. So that's why when we're advocating for them, it's really important to make sure there's a plan for how they're going to get through this. And like I said, I've seen so many clients over the years get into some sort of trouble because they didn't understand what the rules were. They didn't understand, somebody didn't make sure they got it, that there's a deadline for something, or that you can't. Probation is a big one. A lot of people get in deep trouble with probation because they didn't understand that they couldn't speak to this person ever again, or they couldn't go to this restaurant ever again, whatever it was. It's very important to double check with people. And even, for myself, I don't mind if you say to me, now I want you to say back to me, you're meeting me tomorrow at this time if you think I'm not getting it. A lot of times, it's very nerve-wracking to have your children taken from you. And if you're in the process of trying to get them back, that is not the time to rely on your weakest spot. So if I am nervous or upset, like I said, or if I'm sick or I'm really tired and I didn't sleep the night before, I'm not going to be able to hear everything very well. So I know that I have to make you write it down for me, even though you just said it to me. Write it down, send me an email, make sure I've got it. So that's one of the things that we have to make sure we do for our clients. Yes?
I have a question about the previous slide. You had mentioned being certified for legal. Is it not true that in Florida, I thought you did have to have a special type of certification for medical or court interpreting?
No, that's not necessarily true. I will ask you guys if you don't mind. I'm not sure about legal. Do you have to have a certification to interpret in court? No. It's nice and it's really important. Some states require it. Florida does not yet. And Florida was working on trying to have a state license for interpreting, and that didn't go through either. But it may next year. Yes?
You're hired as a court interpreter, you have to obtain certification within a year. That means passing an oral interpreting exam.
Well, really the court should not be hiring interpreters unless they're already certified. And there's been, over the last year, there's been a holdup with some of the licensing for certification process for interpreters. So I'm pretty sure the rule is that you have to be certified. If I were a deaf person, I would not allow anything to move forward without a certified interpreter. John can tell you about that. Do you know anything more, John?
I think what he's talking about is a certification on top of the certificate, the initial certification. And you're
Legal?
talking about specific certification
Oh.
to be a board interpreter within a year.
Right, Florida has a certification process, and they have to attain that within a year of employment if they're not already certified. The goal is to hire a certified interpreter. And if you can't get one that's certified, you're allowed to hire a provisionally approved interpreter to interpret.
I'm not sure. I think that it's possible that might be true for rural areas or somewhere where there was great difficulty in getting an interpreter. But there are interpreting agencies all over the state that have certified interpreters. So I would, as advocates, we should not allow that to happen. Even if there is some rule somewhere, I would push to get a certified interpreter, because if that's my life and my children you're talking about, I don't want some interpreter there that doesn't really know what they're doing. That's scary. I want to make sure I totally understand what's going on. You know what I mean?
It's a Supreme Court rule, check it out.
I'll look for it.
And I think what he may be also referring to is that, you know, in some areas, there are people that interpret, like school systems, and they're not certified yet. You know, maybe they're still going through training, so, you know, maybe, I don't know. I just thought maybe that's the case.
I think that's probably, for education, I think it's more lax for that. But again, I don't think it should be, because who would want that, right? I mean, if you think about yourself, if you go to another country and something terrible happens and you get arrested and you are brought to court and you get some interpreter that kind of sort of speaks English, yeah, that would be really scary. So you have to put yourself in other people's shoes and think, geez, you know, is this okay? And I think it's fair to say, no, this is not okay, and we're going to put this off to a later date until we can get somebody here that can do this. What time is it? What time am I done? 3:30. Oh, okay. How this all starts, when I've noticed that when you call the hotline, when anybody calls the hotline to report child abuse, they try to ask them lots of questions. But it's very important to get as much information from that stage as possible. When the CPI goes out to the house, if they don't have an interpreter with them because nobody mentioned that the parents were deaf or whatever the situation was, that can be where a lot of trouble starts. So it's really important to make sure that communication is happening from that very first knock on the door. A lot of misunderstandings can happen, and people may or may not get their kids taken away, even if maybe they should have been, that kind of thing. It can very much go awry at that point. When interpreters are needed at the school, or if the CPI has to go to a school to interview a child, it's very, very important that they bring their own certified interpreter and not rely on school interpreters or school personnel. There's a lot of issues there with possible bias, or maybe the person doesn't know sign language well enough. And again, it's a scary situation, and kids will get nervous, and you need to make sure you have a certified interpreter that's completely neutral to the situation. And I did mention what a CDI is, and that can be a good thing to use in that situation too. When kids are removed from their home, I'm not sure at what stage you all come into it as a guardian ad litem, but removing kids, if they wear hearing aids, you need to make sure, do they have enough batteries? Are they taking everything with them that they need? If they go to a school where they have a mainstream program or whatever their school is, how are they going to get there? They can't just be popped into another school, especially if they use an interpreter. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration right away, and you don't want them missing too much school until you can get it all figured out. So the more that can be planned as quickly as you know, if you have the questions ready, then you're not falling behind. So like I said, a lot of times with these families, things get so delayed because there's so many questions and people didn't think about them. And a kid is not the one can rely on. they're not going to think about their hearing aid batteries at a time like that, but they're going to need them, right? The court does provide interpreters, and they should. For any court hearings or anything that takes place there, they provide the interpreters. I think it's very important for an advocate to understand a little bit about deaf culture, even if it's just this PowerPoint, just so that you have a sense that their communication needs are so different from everybody else's that you really need to check with them a lot. And that nervousness and fear comes into it. A kid is not the one that needs to be the one responsible for communication. We need to be responsible to make sure they understand. Same thing with deaf parents. It's very unfair to make them go through this process if they're not completely informed and they need to fully understand what's expected of them. So you need to always have an interpreter, or whatever it is that they need, whatever they've told you is their best way for communicating. Also, with placement issues, that's another area where I know there's not a lot of foster homes in Florida. It's true all over the country. There's a terrible shortage of foster homes where people know sign language. So if you can't find one, it is really important to make sure, again, that somebody gets an interpreter in there, at least enough for the child to understand the rules of the house. One of the biggest issues I've seen in my experience was, like I'd mentioned about probation, the kids get into the house and nobody tells them what the rules are, and then they break the rules and they get in trouble and they don't know why, and then it becomes a big problem. So that understanding what's expected of them is huge. And if all they want to know is what do you want from me, and they're usually pretty good about it. But when they feel like nobody cares and nobody's trying to explain anything, and then you get mad at me, it just creates a whole downward spiral. Services are a tricky one. A lot of programs that are very small have a lot of difficulty paying for interpreters, and I totally understand that. How DCF works is money that comes from, if we're contracting with a managing entity or a CBC, and then they subcontract with a smaller program like a family counseling or parenting classes. The managing entity is supposed to make sure that their subcontractors can provide the services to the public, meaning whomever walks through the door. So they need to make sure that system is in place. So if you do come across a subcontractor who is small and doesn't feel they can carry the cost of the interpreter, it really is important to try to talk with their managing entity to see if somebody can work something out financially for them. Or maybe there's another place in town that's bigger that they could go to that has more money for this kind of thing. But it can be a tough one. So it really is important to, if you normally see deaf kids, to try to look in your area to see what kind of services are available. Almost every major city in Florida has some services that deaf people routinely go to. You just have to seek those out. Do you have any questions? You're so quiet. Okay. For reunification, that's another area where it's tough to, when people are making decisions, but they may not understand the person they're making decisions for. And I know that happens all the time for all types of people. For deaf kids, I have seen very good success when bringing subject matter experts into it. So they do parent-child bonding studies, things like that, where you ask a subject matter expert, a deaf person who's a therapist or something like that, to come in and do some sort of assessment rather than the hearing people who don't know sign language just observing and making a decision. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of ways to go about getting some other opinions into it if you need more help. Yes?
Where do I find one of those? How can I get somebody, if I wanted to find someone to do a parent-child bonding assessment on a deaf child?
I've seen people use mental health therapists, psychologists. You can look at any service provider in your area. There's not as many of them left anymore in Florida, but there are some deaf service centers where they provide lots of different services, and you can find out if anybody on their staff has a background in child development or A teacher is iffy. It would have to be someone that has no previous contact with that child. It should be someone that's neutral, somebody that doesn't know the family. But it's usually someone with a child development background or legal background. I'm sorry, mental health of some sort, counseling, or child development.
And an awareness of the deaf culture or.
Yes, definitely. And I know I've been given permission to tell you they don't mind, but the Department of Children and Family Services in Los Angeles has the only real deaf unit in the country where all their CPIs are in-house. They work for the Department of Children and Families, and they have specialized units for a couple of different cultural groups. So they have about, I think right now they have 6 social workers. I think 4 of them are deaf. They have full-time staff interpreters, and they have this down. They work directly with Children's Court, and anytime a call comes into the hotline in Los Angeles County, which is huge, they dispatch their people to take care of that. So it's only people that are specialized in that unit take care of deaf and hard of hearing kids or parents, whomever is involved that's deaf. And they do the parent-child bonding studies. And also San Diego County, I know, does that too, for sure. I'm sure it happens everywhere, but those 2 counties I know utilize that a lot. So the other thing this comes around to definitely is money, time, and the best use of it or waste of it. But the costs associated with encountering barriers can be huge. And if you're sending someone to receive services at a place where they can't receive services, then you're having to start all over again. And it really is very time-consuming for everybody involved. So that's why it's very important to just do a little homework, get the client set up. And sometimes your clients may know. Most deaf people know who the service providers are in their city. They're pretty well aware of what's out there, and they can tell you also. So the effective communication idea, I wanted to make sure that we talked about a little bit because that is the legal basis for the ADA. And there's different ways to do things. So for example, if you have a family that needs to go to parenting classes, and the parenting class is 8 weeks, and everybody is very worried about the cost of an 8-week class, there are different ways to do it. You can't completely deprive them of the group setting and the feedback from the other parents, but you could do all the lead-up paperwork, orientation, things like that, one-on-one with an interpreter, and try to condense maybe the first or the last, or maybe a couple in the middle. Some of the classes can be one-on-one. So you may have subjects each of the 8 weeks, and you may decide that there's a few of those topics in there that would be best done one-on-one. And you can combine 2 or 3 of those classes into one for that family. Or if you have more than one deaf family, confidentiality is an issue within the deaf community. It's not necessarily fair to make them all go to the same class because they all know each other, and that can be difficult. But there are different ways that you can work things out. Again, you have to make sure it's okay with the customer to do some things one-on-one. But sometimes people would prefer that than having to sit and deal with the whole group. Other people may want the benefit of the group, and they may want that support from the other people in the class. So you just have to talk to them and find out what's the best way to do it. For therapy, of course, things like that, you want to make sure you definitely have someone who has some experience, hopefully. If not, then they need to, like for mental health interpreting, it's very important to try to get the same interpreter every time. It's really, really difficult to bare your soul and have a different person in the room. Having a third person in the room is hard enough. But if that person keeps changing, it's very awkward and uncomfortable. And that small world, you see those interpreters out there. You see them at, the grocery store and wherever else. And yes, there's confidentiality, but at the same time, we're still human beings, and it's a tricky situation. So you can Google the area that you're in and just put in deaf Tampa and see what comes up. There's all different types of Google searches you can look for. And I think it's a good idea to have a little bit of a plan should you ever get a deaf client. The worst thing is not being prepared and then having a family show up and scrambling trying to find things. So it's always good to keep a little short list of at least someone you can call should you get someone coming in. The other thing is with the interpreting agencies, I think it's very important to establish a relationship with the interpreting agency. So, like for example, with these guys, I made sure that when I asked for the interpreters that they had experience interpreting at a conference. I don't want an interpreter that just finished their training and would be deer in the headlights at something like this. They know where to sit, how to answer questions, how to handle me, to follow me, to not follow me, whatever. It's very difficult to not know what you're walking into. So if you're interviewing for child abuse, you want to let the agency know we need an interpreter to come with us, and the interpreter needs to be comfortable with this subject matter, because sometimes they're not, and they can leave you stranded. If they decide to walk away, they have a right to walk away. So you want to make sure you give them as much information as possible. And I even tell people about her, because not everybody, I have to give them a heads up about the dog. If I'm bringing her places that I may not be sure, I mean, I can still bring her, of course, legally I can bring her, but at the same time I try to be considerate of where I'm going and the people that are going to be there. I mentioned that. So if you are working directly with DCF resources, every DCF program has a person responsible for coordinating services for deaf and hard of hearing people, and they're called a single point of contact. So if you do have to call up any agency that you know is a DCF program, ask for their SPOC, and that person should be prepared with all the answers you need to your questions, we hope. Sometimes it's tough for them because they may not see deaf clients very often, and so you may need to work together to try to pull it, all the resources together for them. I left that in there because I have used some of this PowerPoint for DCF employees, but I've explained to them that it's really a best practice to discuss what do we do if a deaf client comes along. Are we ready? Do we have a list of resources? Do we know who our what interpreting agency do we contract with? There's a few of them out there, so you want to make sure you know when it comes to billing, who do they contract with? We're updating the website right now with some new information. Our resource list, the auxiliary aid plan, the new one should be up there in a couple of weeks, I hope. But if you go to the Deaf Services page, there's a lot of different information there that you can read. But the Contact Us form that's on that page comes directly to me. So if you ever have any questions or anything about what's happening on that website, go to the Contact Us form and then I'll get it. If you do have any questions about any DCF service or subcontractor, you can call the Civil Rights Office or you can call the General Counsel's office, and they should be able to tell you what you need to know. Also, what might be of interest to you, I'm not sure, this is a long link to write down, but like I said, I think this PowerPoint is somewhere that you can access. And I think there's an update to this already. But the Department of Justice has put out a technical assistance paper regarding child welfare and children with disabilities. And pretty much all disabilities are mentioned in that document, but it really is a good thing to read, and it is also telling us what direction the Department of Justice is going with child welfare. And like I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of different disability groups are actively working to elevate those laws to make them a little more protective of people with disabilities. I threw this in there, you guys should already know this, right? All about the ADA. Do you have any questions about it? Okay. You can always email me if you do. I've tried to find out myself about which areas are the most populated in Florida with deaf and hard of hearing people. So I put them in order of who's biggest. And it looks like the Tampa Bay area has the largest population. And then Jacksonville. And like I said, the School for the Deaf is in St. Augustine, so that's probably why. Then Orlando, and then Miami. The only thing about the Miami area is I bet there's a lot of people down there that are deaf or hard of hearing that aren't counted in the usual ways. But that's true for every area. Not a lot of people. I mean, I've mentioned this before. That when I first moved here to Florida, I thought, well, how am I being counted as a deaf person now living in Florida? They don't ask you when you rent a house. They don't ask you when you get your driver's license. They don't ask. I mean, it doesn't show up when my kids register for school. It doesn't show up when I get a job. I mean, I checked the box just recently on our personnel thing, but it doesn't say what my disability is. It just says, are you disabled? And I check the box. So I'm a deaf person in Florida, but I'm not counted anywhere. I'm not sure how that unofficial information came from my asking people. So the deaf community knows itself pretty well, but it's not like a well-documented statistic type of thing you can find. But each region of Florida does have interpreting services and other types of services that you can that are specialized. Rural areas are the toughest, of course, but you can still make that work. And like I said, especially if there's limited resources, you want to try to establish a relationship with those vendors out there and call them up and say, you know, I have a deaf client right now and I'm going to need some help. I don't know where to start. I don't know who to go to, and they will be happy to help you. I would be shocked if they didn't. Almost everybody is very happy if someone calls up and says, I need you to help me because I have a deaf kid I'm trying to advocate for. And like I said, that auxiliary aids plan will be updated. Don't look at the one that's there now because I'm making tons of changes to it. But the glossary of terms is very helpful if you run into things that you need to look up. I did put in here so that you guys can see, I know you were asking about DCF structure, the responsibility and accountability piece. So it starts with our Assistant Secretary for Administration, and then it kind of goes down to the other assistant secretaries and their hospital administrators and things like that. And then it comes down to the administrator for civil rights. Each region of Florida has a civil rights officer that's responsible for that region. They're very easy to get a hold of if you need anything or have any questions. And that's true for any disability, not just deaf. So the most important thing for us is to make sure, I feel like if you're going to advocate, you need to educate yourself a little bit, and it's perfectly okay not to know everything about everything, but at least know who you can call to ask questions. And ensuring a child's safety is the most important thing. So like I said before, the kids that I have known that were put into a hearing foster home and they had no clue what was going on, and they immediately broke the rules because they went in a room they weren't supposed to go in, or it usually is something small that gets the ball rolling. And then there's already animosity from the get-go. So it really is terribly important to make sure that the kids have some sort of way to communicate, and if whoever has to hire the interpreter, even if you get somebody in for an hour and you cover as much as possible so that the child knows what to do, that is really important. Writing things out for them. I'm trying to think of what other ideas I can give you, but let me know if you have any questions. You must have some. You're thinking something, I can tell. Yes.
I have questions about the foster home and the care for the children. So if they're in a foster home that the parents don't know sign language, I mean, do they just manage on their own with the exception of doctor appointments and, you know, school, they'll have an interpreter? But, you know, like you're saying, when they come across something that they really need to get across to the deaf child, I mean, do they call an interpreter every time? What do they have the right to and who actually pays for that?
It really depends what kind of foster home they're in and what the foster home group is willing to do. So Some of them, I think it's important to try to seek out, before the child is placed, is there anybody that has a home where the parents know at least some sign language, something? And if the answer is no, there's absolutely nobody, then I think it's really important to get the group together, whether it's attorneys, social workers, whoever it is, the CPI, anybody and everybody that's involved in the case, and say, how can we make this communication happen? Somebody's got to pay for it, and in the long run, whoever pays the $75 for that hour or the $150 for the 2 hours, it can save you so much trouble down the road. So it really is worth it for somebody to try to come in and take care of it. It's not fair to a kid to leave them sitting there. So again, I would ask you to imagine yourself, you go on a fabulous trip to Italy or something and you don't speak Italian, and by accident something goes wrong and you get thrown in jail and you have nobody to talk to. Nobody speaks English. And you're sitting there, and of course you're probably going to break the rules and get in trouble. And now you're upset because you got in more trouble and you don't even know what you did wrong. It's very traumatic, and it's re-traumatizing kids all over again. On the other end of the spectrum is deaf parents with hearing children. It's the same situation, sometimes worse. So the hearing children get taken and put in foster care. The deaf parents, if an interpreter didn't come at the time that the children were removed, the deaf parents may have no clue what's going on. It can be very scary and upsetting. They may not get very good information for what they're supposed to do next. Sometimes I've seen people just write down on a piece of paper, show up at court on this day, or call me tomorrow and I'll let you know what's going on. It's very traumatizing. And then you're told, okay, you have to do X, Y, and Z within the next 60 days, and if anything happens in those 60 days, then you can't get those things done because an interpreter didn't show up or nobody scheduled them or whatever. It makes you very panicky. Now, am I not going to get my kids back because they didn't get an interpreter for me? And it can just be a nightmare. So that's why I think if we're advocating for these families, we really have to make sure that you put yourself in their shoes and say, if I was standing there, how would I feel if this was happening to me? And they just want to know exactly what is expected. The kids and the adults just want to know, what is it you want me to do? And then that you've done your job. So, and it is a little different than, if a child has a physical disability and they need to physically be able to get in and out of a place, or, if they're sent to a foster home that's in a condo on the 3rd floor and there's no elevator, there's things like that you have to consider too. But for a deaf child, it's that waking up in the middle of the night and they're sick, or they're having a panic attack or something, then they can't tell anybody. And yes, you can sit and try to write things down, but that's not the same. It's very tough. So that's the kind of thing that makes this a different situation. So, any other questions? Did I get to what you were in education, right? Did you have any other questions for me about the educational piece? No. Okay. The only other thing, like I said before about that, is removal of kids and making sure they can still attend. If they're in a special day program or something like that, and they have interpreters with them all day, you can't just move them to another school. That's very, very disruptive, and that other school may not have those services in place. And what a lot of areas have done now is they have chosen an elementary school in the district, and that's the elementary school where the services are. And all the deaf kids go to that school. That seems to change every few years too, but that's usually what the situation is. So you can't just pull them out and say, go to the elementary school down the street, because it doesn't work. Are you good? Okay. Did you guys have any questions about her? People ask me about that too. If a child has a service dog, that's another big consideration, to make sure wherever they're being placed or where they go to school and all of that, knows what to do with a service dog. Another little added thing, which can usually be a really good thing. Is that falling down? I see it. I'll fix it. Okay? All right. Yes.
How does she help you with your life? I'm just curious, what a day was like with your
She does a lot of things, and it changes depending on where I am. She's being very attentive right now. She wanted me to know that was falling down. Mostly what she does for me is safety kinds of things. So she'll tell me if people are coming and I don't see them, or if somebody comes up behind me and I don't see them. I don't talk on the phone, so there's no phone ringing stuff. She tells me, of course, if someone's at the door. Most dogs will do that. I do tell the story. The best thing she ever did was when my son was like 11, and this was several years ago, and that H1N1 virus thing was going around. Remember that? And he got up at like 3 o'clock in the morning and was throwing up. He was a skinny, tiny little thing, and he passed out on the bathroom floor. And she woke me up. She jumped on me and ran down the hall, and if she had not had me get up, he would have been there until probably 6 o'clock in the morning when we all woke up. And when I took him to the emergency room, and they said he was so dehydrated that if he had laid on that floor for 3 hours, it could have been a lot worse than that. That's probably her best thing she's done, but she worries, which is nice in a way. I was explaining to them earlier that she doesn't always tell me everything because she looks to see if I'm reacting. So if someone knocks on the door and I turn and look, she's not going to do anything. But if I don't look, like thing was falling down, and she was, I don't know if you saw her, she put her head up and was like staring at me like, look. But if she sees that I'm not doing what she thinks I should be doing, she'll tell me. You know what we're talking about, you know? That's it. But I feel safer having her with me, especially when I travel in hotel rooms and things like that. There's pros and cons. This is something else. It may just be me, but I don't always like to tell the hotel that I can't hear, especially when I travel alone, because it shows up on their computer for anybody to see that works in the hotel. And for me, that doesn't feel very safe. So sometimes I'll ask for the room with the doorbell, but if I have her, I don't, because she'll tell me if somebody comes to the door of the fire alarm. The fire alarms are all strobe lights anyway. And I have my little alarm clock that vibrates, so I don't really need the accessibility stuff like that. But I just feel safer having her with me because I know that if something happens, she will tell me. So I can sleep and I don't need to worry about it. When I have traveled without her, it's very hard for me to sleep. So I think for children in school, it's also another safety thing. Like she taught herself to alert me or she'll walk in front of me. If we're out walking on the street and somebody comes right up behind me, she doesn't like that. So she'll turn me around. She'll walk in front of me. And the first few times she did that, I was like, what are you doing? I didn't understand what you were doing. And then I realized somebody was right behind me. So she's come up with some of her own things. And that's why, again, for service dogs, for people that can't hear, is a very different situation. So for someone in a wheelchair or someone who's blind, they're trained to do very specific tasks. She has to think. And like I said, worry, sort of. Like if something bothers her, she thinks it should bother me. But she's had to decide for her, because I can't hear whatever's happening. So I can't train her to every situation. She has to decide if it's important. And she's very good at it. She knows now what I can hear and what I can't. That's very cool. But people that are blind, that is a much more rigid kind of training. They have to do the same thing all the time, the same way, because a blind person needs that. The dog can't make decisions and do something different one day. You know what I mean? So it's a fascinating thing. Dogs are very smart. And also, I know I'm going to try to stay for a little bit of the next session is about service animals, but the law did change in January for Florida that service animals can only be a dog or a miniature horse. And the miniature horses have been great for people that usually have no feeling from their neck down, because a horse is strong enough to pull you out of bed, that kind of thing. They can physically move you, and a dog is not strong enough. But people were trying to pass off all kinds of other animals as service animals, but now Florida just says dogs and the miniature horses. And I think it's only certain breeds of miniature horses can be trained to do that, because some of them are really feisty, but there are certain breeds that can be trained and are very smart. So I'm really glad that they changed the law because it's very upsetting to put all the time into training a service dog and then have people running around with their other dogs, whatever, that are very badly behaved and are clearly not a service animal. So I think that's what we're going to talk about in the next one, probably. So do you guys have any other questions? You're very welcome to email me if you think of anything later, or we can, anybody at DCF's Civil Rights Office or General Counsel Office. Alrighty, well thank you very much.